My name is Stephanie, and welcome to the first episode of Making Poor Decisions. Let's make some mead. If you've been following me on Instagram for a while, you know I've been making mead for about a year now. And in the course of that year, I've gotten a lot of questions like, what are your recipes? Can you show me a tutorial? And while there are a plethora of wonderful mead makers here on YouTube, I got to thinking, why not me too? So here we are today. But before we actually make our mead, I want to go into a little bit of history of what mead is, in case you don't know. Mead is our oldest known fermented beverage. It's been made in Egypt. The Chinese have made their own version of mead, and of course we know the Vikings, obviously. But in ancient times it was made just a little bit different than how I'm going to show you now. So in ancient times, the mead was essentially just honey and water. Nowadays we add a packet of commercial yeast to that honey and water, and that's because we have what's called spun honey today, or processed honey. So we take our honey and basically clean it up for widespread commercial sales. But again, long ago, we didn't spin our honey, we just kind of took it. And when we took that honey, there was a lot of additives in that. Sometimes it was bee parts, but most important ingredient was bee pollen. And bee pollen had wild yeast. So when you mixed that raw honey, that unfiltered honey with the water, it's going to start that fermentation process naturally. But again, we have something called spun honey now, so we just have to add an extra ingredient that would have been in the natural process. So that little bit of history out of the way, let's get started. Now, everything that you are going to need to make mead, I have right here on the table, and I will show a close-up of that video with the close-up ingredients here. In the description of this video, there is an affiliate link to Homebrew, Ohio. Now, the affiliate link does not cost you any extra, but it does put a little bit of money in my pocket. So if you wanted to make your own brew, I then, again, just really recommend going to Homebrew, Ohio, shop small, stop putting money in the pocket of Big Daddy Bezos. Now, without further ado, let's get started. So first thing I'm going to do is grab my scale. And it's not something that you necessarily need to make mead, but it's great for keeping records. So just in case you wanted to make it again, or if you think something would have went wrong, I definitely highly recommend taking notes. Because again, if we don't write it down, it never happened. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is take my honey. Now, my honey has actually been sitting in a warm bucket of sanitization water, the honey itself, not the honey itself, the jars. You don't necessarily have to do this part, but it does make your life a little bit easier in the long run, because what it does is it liquefies a little bit better, which means it's easier to pour. Don't know why I put the lid back on, but I did, so here we are. So yeah, it just makes it flow a little bit better. And the honey that I'm using today is from a company called Be Natural. They're out of the Philly area. I actually found them when I used to live in Philadelphia. They were selling at the Reading Terminal Market. So they're a nice little small business out on the East Coast. So I definitely recommend their honey. Again, not sponsored by Be Natural. I'm just a fan of their product. And I have 3 1-pound containers that I'm going to put in my 1-gallon carboy or fermenter. And I'm going to do that now and cut, because you don't need to see about 15 minutes of me pouring honey into a glass carboy. Our honey is now in our fermenter. I had 3 pounds of honey here, but I got about just under 3 pounds in my fermenter. Some get stuck in the bottle, some get stuck on the cap, and I'm not really that worried about it. Overall, I have 2 pounds, 14 ounces of Tulepo honey, and that's plenty. The bare minimum amount of honey that you need in order to make mead is about 1.5 pounds. It's going to make a really dry mead, which I normally prefer, but I'm actually going to go a little bit sweeter this time around. I made a basic mead about May of last year, so that's May of 2021. And I really liked it, but I'm going to try for a slightly different style, just a slightly sweeter version of this. So last year I did 2 pounds of honey, and now I have close to 3 pounds of honey in this mead. See what's going on, or in this must. So a must, by the way, is the combination of the water, the honey, and the yeast. It's what it is before it turns into mead. And I actually missed a very important step in the beginning of this video. So everything that you see on this counter here, from my fermenter to my graduated cylinder, hydrometer, all of the instruments you see in front of me, they have all been sterilized in this bucket, which contains very, very hot water, and this solution right here, which is called Star San. And it's so important, guys, to sterilize your instruments, because if you don't, you might be introducing a nasty little bug into your brew that can ruin it. It can grow mold, it can grow fungus, and it's basically not good for your brews. Now, mead is naturally antimicrobial, that is true, but we want to take some extra precautions and sanitize everything. I even dipped my hands in this solution to sterilize, or not sterilize, but sanitize my own hands. So that out of the way, we have all of our honey in our fermenter, as I mentioned. The next step is adding a cup of tea. Now, is adding a cup of tea needed to make mead? No, it's not at all. But what it adds is tannins. Now, you can do this by adding a very strongly brewed cup of any black tea of your choice. You probably can use other teas as well. And here we go, making a mess. Or there's other additives you can add as well, basically powdered tannins, because that's what the tea adds. It adds tannins, which adds a bit of a different mouthfeel, kind of like a pucker, which gives some depth to your mead. The next thing I'm going to add in this little bucket here, which I'll show a close-up shot of these guys, but this is essentially dried tangerine peels. I'm adding about 5 of them in here. Do I need to do that through the funnel? No, absolutely not. Now we're stuck. And there we go. First time video, folks, sorry. There we go. Plunk. And what the dried tangerine peels do is they add acidity. So you have the tannins from the tea, you have the acidity from the tangerine peels, and it balances everything out. Now again, are these things needed? Not necessarily. I like a little bit more complexity in my mead, which is why I add them. If you don't want to add tea, you don't want to add tangerine peels, and you can get basically powdered substitutes to add in there, we can. But I think they also add a nice little bit of flavor too. I've added them in every single one of my brews, and I've liked all of my brews so far, except for skooma. But we don't have to talk about skooma just yet. So anyway, we have our honey, we have our tea, we have our tangerine peels. One thing that I'm actually leaving out of this mixture is raisins. And now I've added raisins in every single one of my brews since I started last year. But there's a big controversy in raisins and mead. And I know it's going to sound very strange for me to say controversy with raisins. But for a while, people added raisins because they thought that it was a nutrient for the yeast. But kind of found out that that's not true. And then there are other people out there that say that it adds tannins or it adds depth, and other people are saying that that's not true. If you go on to any type of mead thread in Reddit or anywhere on the internet or even here on YouTube, you will actually find arguments on whether or not you should add raisins to your mead. And I didn't know any better at first, so I started adding my raisins, and I liked all of my meads again, except for skooma. We don't have to talk about skooma. But I'm not adding them in this time because I want to know for myself, does it make a difference? Is this mead going to taste the same as the mead that I made last year? Who knows? But if I don't have to add the raisins and I can make it a little bit of a faster process, I'm going to try that. So now the next thing I'm going to do, or I should say my husband's going to do, because I'm slightly broken if you haven't noticed, is put this bung in the top and shake it up. And what that's going to do is it's going to incorporate the honey, the water, the tea, and the orange peels that we put in, aerate aerate the brew, my goodness. And it just makes it nice and easy to incorporate at this stage. If you've put the water, again, this is my spring water here, all the way to the top and try to shake it, doesn't really leave a lot of room for the things to kind of incorporate and move and groove. So add it about halfway, shake it, and then we can finish filling up the fermenter with the rest of the water. So I'll be right back after that is all shaken up. Alrighty, now my lovely assistant has been so kind to mix up my honey, my tea, and my water. Has aerated my brew, which we want to introduce oxygen in the beginning of fermentation, not at the end, because again, you need the oxygen in there in order for fermentation to kick up. After it gets going, if you jostle around too much, introduce more oxygen, you can actually end up with vinegar, which might not necessarily be bad, but it's not the most pleasant to drink. So if you're trying to drink it, add the oxygen in the beginning and then just kind of leave it alone for a couple of weeks. So now I'm going to add in, and I should probably not be listing this, but who cares, right? That's why we have health insurance. I'm going to add in more water, and I want to add in just enough water so that the must reaches the shoulders of the fermenter. And when I say the shoulders, I mean just about this area. You want to go a little bit above the curve. And here, I'm going to stop there because I'm also going to add in some yeast, this mixture. And what this mixture is, it's basically just fermaid-o. What fermaid-o is essentially just yeast hulls or dead yeast mixed in and diluted with a little bit of water. Fermaid-o is kind of just looks like a powder. And the reason that I do this is actually is yeast nutrient. So yeah, the yeast is going to eat the sugar in the honey, but the fermaid-o and the yeast nutrient, because I can speak, just helps kicking off fermentation. And the yeast that I'm going to use for today's brew is Lalvin D47. And it is a really nice yeast that you can use to make white wine or mead, and it has about fruity esters, I think, or esters. And esters basically can add a smell or a flavor component to your meads. There's a bunch of different yeasts out there that are wonderful, and they'll add a little bit something different to each of your brews. I like D47 because it has fruity esters. Lalvin 71B is great because it's honestly the most powerful yeast I've ever used. The last batch of mead I used came out to 21% ABV. It is a beast. I was not planning on it being that high. I used about 3 pounds of honey, expecting it to eat through most of the sugar, because I think it's supposed to be like 14 to 17% ABV, something like that. But you know, yeast are gonna do what yeast are gonna do. So I put in a lot of honey and sugar and it ate all of it. I was hoping to get a semi-sweet brew, and I got a very dry, very strong brew that's gonna have to mellow out for a while. And again, if you've been following me on Instagram, you know exactly which brew that is. That was my Darjeeling Express tea, and yeah, it'll expressly put you to sleep. So I'm gonna add a full packet of this. Do you need a full packet of this? Probably not. I had been using half of a packet, but the last few brews I ended up throwing in the full packet, and you know, it worked out just as well. But if you want to be a little bit more frugal, you want to save your yeast, half a packet will suffice. There's other people out there who will tell you that you actually need to hydrate your yeast, get it kick-started before you put it in your brew. I'm gonna be perfectly honest, I've never done that, and I've never had a brew fail to start. So you can hydrate your yeast. certainly do that. If you've had your yeast packets for a while, a year or longer, then yeah, you might want to hydrate it just to see if it kicks up. Make sure you don't have a bunch of dead yeast in here, but this is a brand new packet and I trust this brand a lot. So I'm going to throw her right in there and I'm going to give it a swirl with one hand. So I'm not supposed to be using this one, but I do. The next step in the process is measuring how much sugar you have, or measuring the gravity of the yeast. Is this step necessary? Again, no. You know, if you're just concentrating on making a tasty brew, you're pretty much done. You put your bung in, you put your airlock in, you let it sit for a couple of weeks. But if you're somebody like myself who really wants to know the ABV of your meads, of your wines, of your ciders, of your beers, whatever you're doing, then you're going to need to do this next step. So first things first is you take your little baster here, and this is actually a brewer's baster. I tried doing this with a regular turkey baster when I first started, and it didn't work out too well. Let me see if I can do this at this angle. So I definitely suggest getting a brewer's baster. Again, you can get that Homebrew Ohio or any of your local homebrew shops. You can get it on Amazon too, but if you can shop local, do it. Alrighty, so we have our must in our graduated cylinder, dropped our hydrometer in there, and I'm getting an initial gravity reading of 1.11, which is pretty strong. It's pretty sweet. And what this does is it measures the sugar content in your brew. So you start with an initial gravity, take it at the beginning. You can do one in the middle as well, but as long as you have an initial gravity reading and a final gravity reading, you basically take those two numbers, you subtract the second reading or the final reading from the first reading, and you can calculate your ABV there. Do I know the ABV calculation off the top of my head? No, I have an app. I have an app that does it for me, but I can throw the calculation into the description in this video if you would like to know it. And I'll also list the app that I use in the description in case you want that as well. Now, what some people might be upset that I just did is I put some of that liquid back into my fermenter, but I sanitized everything, so it's okay. I've done it with all my brews. Haven't had one fail, haven't had one get moldy or turn gross. So I'm pretty happy with doing that. Next step, add the bung to the bung hole and an airlock with sanitization fluid in it. You could also use like vodka or liquor that you don't necessarily like or use. But what this does is does a couple things actually. You can actually watch it bubble up, which is what I like to do when fermentation starts off. You'll see air bubbles go from here all the way up to this S shape here and out. It also keeps things like actual bugs or bacteria from getting in, because anything that tries to get down to the top of this airlock will be met with this sterilized water and or sanitized water, and be met to a grisly doom. But that's pretty much it. That's how you make mead. Next step, you wait. You let it sit for a while. Usually I let mine sit for about 2 weeks. That's typically enough. But when I stop seeing activity in my airlock, that's usually a good sign, to me at least, that I can start putting it into secondary. And what's secondary? Well, essentially you take the mead that's now in this fermenter and you put it into another fermenter. And if you check back in about 2 weeks, I'll have that video posted as this goes into secondary. But that's pretty much it for today's video. Check back with me next time where we're going to be making an acerglyn, and that is essentially a mead with honey and maple syrup. Catch you next time. One more quick tip too. Before you just let your mead sit, make sure you're putting it in a cooler space that's out of the sunlight. Direct sunlight can do damage to your little yeasty beasties. And a cooler place is better. Something that's cold, the yeast are going to stop fermenting. Something that's too warm, or a place that's too warm, it can actually create some off flavors in your brews. So anywhere that's cool and dark, if you have a basement, if you have a closet, you can throw it in there and it'll be good to go. But yeah, that's it. Thanks, guys.